pleasant evening to one and all. A hearty welcome to the first session of Crossroads of ConveRVsations 2021. Crossroads of Conversation is a forum initiated by RV College of Architecture to involve alumni across the globe and with the current college scenarios and to be part of various discussions and exchange of ideas. With rapid urbanizations and limited resources, the question of sustaining cities and their people remain indispensable to our times. The sixth webinar of Crossroads of ConveRVsation Series 2020 to 2021 hosts a panel of speakers sharing their thoughts and experiences related to various aspects of food and water systems in urban habitats in China, US, and India.
As the first speaker of the day, we have architect Parul Rewal, who also is an urbanist, having lived and worked in India, South Africa, Singapore, and the UK. She holds a master's degree in urban management from City University, Hong Kong. As an architect, she has been involved in master planning and design of institutional and educational campuses, residential buildings, metro stations, as well as conservation and adaptive reuse of heritage buildings. She has been a city-based researcher for NYU Stern, the UN Habitats Urban Expansion Project, and the Global Municipal Database for Hong Kong. Her research interests are related to urban governance, housing affordability, public space, the urban informal sector, food security in cities, and the slow food movement. She has also been exponent of Odissi dance as a disciple of late Guru Hare Krishna Bahera, and she believes that the values of balance and grace embedded in dance are the very root of sustainability. Parul Ma'am has been dabbling with growing vegetables and herbs in her house garden in Shanghai using compost created from her kitchen waste and is studying permaculture principles to apply to her own small plot of land in the hills of Uttarakhand. She has also been advocating the health benefits of fermented foods and makes her own kombucha, pickled vegetables, and slow fermented sourdough bread. She currently serves as vice president of the Royal Asiatic Society RAS China and congregates talk series focused on architecture and urbanism titled RAS Beyond City. Through this talk series, she has been attempting to build a dialogue between academia and lay people about ideas around cities and urbanizations. A very warm welcome to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Anaga. So, should I begin, or are you going to introduce the other speakers as well?
No, go ahead, Parul.
You can go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to just share screen quickly. Okay, is that clear? Coming through? Yeah. So I'm going to be sharing some ideas about the relationship of food and the city and bringing some perspectives from Shanghai in China, which is where I currently live. So all of us who work in the urban sphere, we are taught to harbor a lot of ideas about cities and the ideal of urbanization. Cities are dynamic sites of endless opportunities. And as per the usual tropes, this is where economic growth happens. Due to their high density and proximity of people and the diversity they harbor, cities are the hubs of culture and creativity and innovation, the creative city. Of course, they offer a much better living standard than their rural counterparts with better access to healthcare, education, and services. And we have, of course, McKinsey's of the world advising national governments of developing countries to urbanize, urbanize, urbanize as part of the economic development strategies. Now, somewhere around 2009, 2010, the world crossed the 50-50 mark. And for the first time in history, more people were living in urban areas than in rural ones. And of course, by 2050, almost 75% of the world will be urbanized. Now, and most of this, it's quite daunting actually to recognize that 1/6 of humanity already lives either in a Chinese or an Indian city. And this is where the most rampant urban growth is also expected to occur in the coming years. So while it's indeed exciting to be in these parts of the world and working in the architectural and urbanization sphere, because the next 30 years is really where a lot of action will be happening right in our own backyards. But it also means that we need to reevaluate and rethink the urbanization ideal and how this process should be evolving to prepare for the future. There are, of course, going to be increasing pressures on resources, including housing and infrastructure. But one of the factors that sort of gets overshadowed or taken for granted is that of food. So I'd just like to take a little bit of time to look at the relationship between food and the city. Now, with growing urbanization, it's becoming apparent that not only are cities expanding, they're growing in size several times the actual growth in population. So as the NYU Stern Urban Expansion Program discovered, when it studied a sample of 200 cities across the globe over the last 20 years, was that if a city's population growth is X over the last 20 years, the increase in land area that it starts occupying could be 2 or 4 or even up to 7 times X. So in effect, what's happening is that cities, much as we value density in cities and propound compactness in cities, density of cities is falling. And as they do this, they're encroaching and swallowing up agricultural land at their periphery at a much greater rate than we imagine. And secondly, of course, urbanization does lead to a fall in agricultural employment, as there are obvious structural shifts from agriculture towards industry, manufacturing, or services. So that really raises the pertinent question that who is really going to be, growing food for a growing population of urban citizens. Sorry, I can't proceed with my slide share.
Why? What happened? It's hanging?
Locked.
Locked?
Can you just try, take it out of presentation mode? And
It just did move.
It's come back. It's come back. Yeah. So really, who is going to be growing food for this growing urban population? So now if we look at the case of China, since 1966, China has been the largest agricultural producer in the world. And in the last 2 decades, its agricultural output per capita has increased more than any other country in the world. But also in the same last 2 decades, China has lost over 123,000 square kilometers of farmland to urbanization, which is almost the size of the entire state of Tamil Nadu. And of the arable land that remains, it's estimated that 1/6 of this land is highly polluted. So while China is the largest agricultural producer, it's also the largest user of chemical fertilizers and pesticides in the world, which has resulted in really wide scale water and soil pollution, which the government is finding very hard to now remediate. And in fact, in 2015, China's agricultural sector surpassed its industrial sector in becoming the largest polluting industry in China. So this chart just sort of demonstrates amongst the 10 top agricultural producers of the world, how much pesticides and fertilizers is being used per unit of land. China compared to US, India is still relatively better in terms of pesticides, but uses a high degree of nitrogen fertilizers. So combined with this, the fact that cities are actually just massive sites of consumption. Now, this is attributed to the fact that increased income in cities leads to greater spending on food. There's also increased availability of food due to cold storage facilities and refrigeration. Then, of course, there are changes in tastes and preferences, which is manifested in a shift in diet from starchy staples to a much more richer and diverse diet of, including meat, dairy, fruits, and vegetables. Also, what is seen is that due to an increased value of women's time while working in urban areas, this causes a shift from home-cooked to takeout meals. So, of course, this is accompanied by a lot of health issues, environmental issues, greater use of land, water, and energy resources, a greater amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and of course, brings up issues of food security. Now, if we just look at the meat consumption patterns over the decades, this has increased exponentially over the globe. In 1960, the average Chinese ate 4 kgs of meat a year. By the late 1980s, this had risen to 20 kgs. And right now, it's also the average Britisher ate 25 kgs of meat a year. That figure is over 80 kilograms now. USA, Argentina, Australia have the highest per capita meat consumption, which is more than 100 kilograms per year. Thankfully, here, India is one exception. It has a very low meat consumption per capita, less than 4 kilograms, which has not changed much despite average incomes tripling since 1980. But this is largely due to our cultural background. Now, the need to produce sufficient food to urbanizing societies has resulted in these three major phenomena. Intensive commercial farming with high concentration of fertilizer and pesticide, control of food production by large agricultural conglomerates, and a tremendous loss of biodiversity in the range of crops that are being grown. So Caroline Steele, in her book, Hungry City, which I would really recommend for everybody to read, it's even more relevant today than it was a decade ago when it came out. She lays out a scathing view of the major trends that characterize the global food industry in the developed world. So the entire global grain supply, 90% globally, is run by 5 companies in the world. The world tea market is in the hands of 3 companies, and 81% of American beef belongs to 4 giant processing companies. Now, these major traders don't just trade produce as a physical commodity. They operate all the way from farm level to food manufacturing. They are landowners. They provide seeds, agro stock, fertilizers to all the growers. Then they buy all the agricultural output and store them in their own facilities. So they act as landowners, cattle and poultry producers, transportation providers, food processors, biofuel producers, as well as providers of financial services in the commodity markets. So these traders have become instrumental in converting food production into a very complex, globalized and financialized business. Therefore, they have an impact on food prices, access to scarce resources like land and water, climate change, and food security. But if you look at biodiversity, it's shocking to realize that 90% of milk in the US now comes from a single breed of cow. And similarly, 90% of commercial eggs from a single breed of hen. And British supermarkets have reduced well over 2,000 varieties of locally grown apples for all practical purposes down to 2. And the similar things are happening in India. If you listen to Vandana Shiva, she talks a lot about how we're losing out on thousands of traditional varieties of rice and grain and vegetables and fruit. So this should really give us a cue to what farmer protests in India have been against. This anticipated growing monopolization of the agricultural sphere by industrial giants, which would then take a similar path as it has in the developed world. Okay, again, frozen. I think this is because my connection is a little bit unstable. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a little, once in a while, it's a little, but yeah, we can hear you more or less. Do you want to take it out of presentation mode and then try? Does that work?
Okay, I don't know what's happening. My screen is frozen. Shit.
The other thing you could do is just send it to one of us and perhaps we could share. Would that work? Just give it a moment and see.
But I can't do anything with my screen frozen. Okay, anyway, I'll talk, and if this comes back, it should come back. Wait. No, not working. Okay, anyway, so one of the other resulting phenomena we witness is that as cities develop and modernize, and it's very evident in how we plan and design schemes, the way we present drawings to clients, we tend to gravitate towards this homogeneous ideal of modernity, where traditional is being replaced with modern, small scale with big scale, and disorganized with organized. And the same thing happens where food is concerned. You know, the chaotic, bustling, messy vegetable and food markets are being replaced by neat, sanitized produce aisles in supermarkets with air conditioning and excessive packaging. So this is something that really magnifies what the economist E.F. Schumacher brings out in his book, Small is Beautiful, which says that the main problem with cities is how far removed they are from the source of their food and the sites where their waste is being dumped, which is a large part of the reason why we behave so irresponsibly with our resources. So how should this figure in how we envision our urban futures? Do we need to rethink the ethos behind food and how we grow it and how we consume it? So for the last 5 years, I've been living in Shanghai, which is one of the largest cities in the world, with a population of 25 million. So one can imagine what a challenge it is to feed a city that scale. Okay, I really need this to come back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to maybe, you're not able to unshare either, right? So do you want to maybe log out and log in again? And while you're doing that, just send it to me.
Okay, so I'll get out of the.
For her.
Okay.
Let me just
Yeah.
stop her sharing.
So I'm going to disappear for a minute.
Or Shweta says she's going to stop sharing. Yeah, you disappear. I mean, she's going. Shweta, you'll do that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to share something. But hers is still seen, no, right? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, can you reshare
Now
that?
it's yeah.
Try again.
So can you see now? No.
No, not yet. No, it's not even saying that you're trying
Okay.
to share. Do you want to just send it across?
Let's see if this works quickly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, so this is what I was talking about, the whole transition from, messy vegetable food markets. Now this is kind of the, the standard of food supply and distribution. So yeah, Shanghai, megalopolis of, 25 million. So now in these two pictures, you can see the growth of these, of the city. 35 years ago, 1987, the east side of the Huangpu River was virtually undeveloped marshland. This is what you see on the top part of the top picture. And by 2010, it had become a bustling secondary business district for the city. The population of the city had more than tripled in this period, from 6 million to in the vicinity of 20 million. So you can imagine, feeding a city this scale at which has grown so fast. Well, so far the Shanghai food shed is very well developed. There's no dearth of food, but the quality of the food is very circumspect. When we moved here, you had to be very wary about, what milk to buy, where to buy, where to source vegetables. Okay, it's frozen. I don't know why this is happening. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple of initiatives that are centered around food. Some of them are top-down planning initiatives, and the others are just civic movements by people and organizations that are trying to create change where food systems are concerned. So the first is this, the city of Shanghai's very ambitious plans for an urban farming district. Now, this came about as a winning entry for an open competition held by one of the state-owned agricultural development boards, under whose jurisdiction the land in the district belonged. So the scheme aims to position Shanghai as a leader in urban food production, and also to establish a new paradigm for urban life, integrating everyday city life with agricultural production, education and research facilities related to food production, along with food tourism. So it seeks to provide a very robust public realm, which merges the indoor and outdoor agricultural production. And it also experiments with the idea of celebrating food production as one of the most important functions of a city. So the Sunchao Urban Farming District is on a 100-hectare site located midway between the international airport and the city center. So the reason why I say this was an ambitious project is because there was a lot of developmental pressures on this tract of land, which is positioned as prime land for the next phase of the city's expansion. It's surrounded by, upcoming eco-industrial parks, high-tech zones. It already had a metro station coming up. And IKEA was planned in the offing. And Disneyland is just one stop away from this site by metro. So typically, had it been business as usual, it would have developed, into big box retail and logistics centers. But this was an opportunity to rethink the site. So the land was already functioning as a test bed for agriculture. The land was dotted with single-story greenhouses in collaboration with foreign companies. So as a principal at Sasaki, the architectural firm who headed the project puts it, it was like taking the existing mission of food production and just putting it on steroids. So the site is 100 hectare of land, which is 1 kilometer square. So if you want to imagine that city scale, it's a little larger than the size of Lal Bagh in Bangalore. And the site was divided by 2 existing canals. And the scheme basically sought to interweave agriculture into residential and commercial life. Okay, we are again frozen. Sorry about this. Okay. So this experiments with producing clean, high quality food within the dense format of the city fabric, using vertical food factories, which employ hydroponics and aquaponics. This would also lead to increased yields per unit land. And for crops such as tomatoes and kale, this could go up to almost 40 to 60 times of traditional output. This would cut transportation time for delivering food to the city. And of course, in character with the urban setting, it relies on maximized automation and minimizing human labor. So this would form an innovative district focused on creating forward-looking platforms for advanced agricultural research, startups, and exhibitions. And it would serve as a case study for scaling this up in other parts of the country and something that other cities could follow as a model. It has a very strong educational and research-centric mission centered on food production, with a highly interactive core, which makes city dwellers and school children understand where their food comes from and engage with the processes of food production. So this is conceived as a completely walkable district with commercial use centered around the subway station. And then that leads off to research and production facilities, which are interwoven with a lot of recreational spaces, farming museums, interactive greenhouses, arboretums, and sky gardens. So the existing canals would serve as an interactive waterfront with civic plazas and digital amphitheaters, canal parks, and they would showcase aquaponics and service sites for food tourism, featuring weekly produce markets and farm-to-table restaurants. Now, the vertical greenhouses, of course, save space in a city where land is, of course, at a heavy premium. But luckily, the traditional Shanghainese diet comprises almost 50 to 60% of leafy greens, which are ideal for hydroponics. They grow faster, so it's a very quick yield time. And the system that is used saves water because it's just recycled through the whole system. So aquaponics provides natural fish waste as fertilizer. And because it's a highly controlled indoor environment, the need for chemical pesticides is almost eliminated. Now, the reason why this was also very attractive to the government and why they tied into the idea is that these vertical greenhouses also offer the potential to tie into other industries that are booming in China at the moment. LED lighting is used extensively in hydroponics for indoor growing. And it also sort of gives a nod to solar power, which is another booming industry in China. So the site collects stormwater and grey water is collected from buildings, and modern filtration techniques along with natural aquatic plants, as well as algae ponds to filter it, allow it to be reused for irrigation, planting in the greenhouses. And also, it's fed back into to regenerate the canals. So these are really experiments with, demonstrating a circular economy within food systems. The various systems feed each other. Food waste is decomposed into compost, compost goes into planting, seeds go back into production process, fish excrement feeds the plants, and so on and so forth. So these are really experiments with systems which could then be scalable elsewhere. And this model could really be a game changer in bringing food production into, center stage in city planning, and developing a microeconomy around it through businesses and food tourism. So next, I'd like to talk about some civic initiatives centered around food in the city. One, of course, is that of urban farming. This is, of course, quite common in a lot of cities. Here, Ricky is a social entrepreneur, and she leases rooftops of industrial buildings like flatted factories in the midst of the city. And then she puts in quite a bit of capital and converts them into rooftop farms. Now, she has self-taught herself chemical-free methods of farming, seasonal cycles of growing specific crops, which we as city dwellers, are not so in tune with, and using symbiotic plants that grow well together, natural pest control methods. And she has been trying to build awareness by engaging with the public. She runs a rooftop cafe, which provides lunch made with fresh produce. And along with that, she holds workshops for kids and adults, and companies or families can lease a planting patch and then come tend to it to be with nature, and also to avail of the produce from that patch. So this concept, of course, is quite common. I think in Bangalore has a lot of terrace farms, and allotment farms can be found in a lot of US cities. But another more impressive venture is this one, Urban Rural Bridges and Rainbow of Hope, which is doing phenomenal work to connect rural farmers with urban consumers. Now, Rainbow of Hope was founded by Fred Yang. He's a bright young man who was the first from his village to come out to get a university education, work in a corporate job in real estate, and then he decided to go back to help his community. Now, his mission was really to strengthen the rural communities, to provide sustainable agricultural practices, and linking urban families with rural farmers while providing healthy, safe, and chemical-free food. So what he's basically done is, he's tried to mobilize local farmers into a cooperative, so they consolidate small farms into a more manageable common. This allows for them to bulk purchase seeds, livestock, fertilizers, farm equipment, and it also ensures that the local farmer families get more competitive profits, income or profits. At the same time, he's also training them in good agricultural practices, permaculture, reverting to natural and more traditional regenerative farming practices, absolutely no chemical fertilizers or pesticides or growth hormones, no GMO crops are grown. And they're also trying to bring back a diversity of traditional crops, which have been disappearing slowly in China. Then at the next step, so through using technologies such as, a mini app, you just have to scan a QR code and you can connect to the cooperative and order food. So you could either adopt a field for a year and get the produce of that at a certain fee, or you can just prepay for a subscription for a box which comes to you weekly for, say, 3 kilograms of vegetables, whatever's growing locally, seasonally. And at the same time, he tries to build stakeholder engagement and trust. They provide comfortable traditional style lodging at the farms so that members who are subscribers to the produce can actually come to visit, to witness the production process. These are just some pictures from the farm that he works with. So what also happens is that it reduces the carbon footprint of food supply, because you're mobilizing a geographically very close network of farms around a city for delivery. The packaging that they use is 100% reusable, recyclable, or biodegradable. And of course, they have a long-term goal of providing renewable energy to farms. And this also helps to prevent food waste. They hold flash sales of surplus products. And at the same time, they're educating the urban consumer to accept, bruised, irregular, ugly-looking produce as per season. Now, what this also does is it makes it socially sustainable for farmers to remain in the villages with their families and have an improved life and an improved income instead of having to migrate to the cities. Now, a big phenomena in China is that the working age population migrates to cities, and the people who are left in the villages are basically the elders and the children. And it's a very sort of, it's almost cruel actually to separate, to break up families like that. So this really brings in, helps to socially make their lives better. Lastly, I'd just like to touch a little bit about on the urban informal sector and food. Now, Shanghai doesn't really have slums because it's a very highly controlled city and it's impossible to squat or build unauthorized shelter here. But what does exist is what is known as the lane houses. Now, these are typically row housing built in the 1920s in the city, which were evacuated of their original residence when the Communist Party took over in 1949, and the city youth were all sent off to villages to engage in farming. And later, when China decided to follow an industrialization trajectory, the working class was moved back to cities. So these houses were then subdivided and used for resettling lower income workers under the communist regime. So each home has been subdivided into an average of 6 to 8 units for families, and then retrofitted to add services, water, electricity, sanitation. So you can see that, some of these homes were at one point very grand buildings. You can see beautiful details, but now it's just reduced to shanty houses. Some of them don't even have sanitation yet, and they rely on chamber pots for night soil, and then somebody comes to collect it, and then they go dump it in, the outskirts of the city. And here you can see there are, each house has 7 to 8 post boxes. They have separate meters for each family that's living there. Some of them have courtyards. So this is really almost like, Mumbai Chawl for worker housing. There's a separate tap and a sink allotted to each family. And this is where, they cook, and life spills out on the streets. But what's really interesting is how much food you see out on the streets when you walk here. Every nook and cranny has pots and large thermocol boxes growing herbs and vegetables that they use to supplement the food they buy. Chives and spring onions, garlic, ginger, tomatoes, pumpkins, sometimes grapevines. And you see food being cooked, out on the street. There is food being hung out to dry. Here, if you see the picture on the right, that's a piece of meat. In spring, they hang meat so that they can, dry it and keep it for consumption later. And, every nook and cranny and corner has a breakfast food stall or somebody, offering lunch. And during festival times, a lot of these factories pop up, which produce typical festive foods for sale. So this is the jongja, which is like a bamboo leaf, which has rice with duck yolk and some meat. And it actually comes out during the Dragon Boat Festival, which is about to happen next week. Ice going for, from these factories to serve the city. And of course, my pet favorite theme is, how repair stalls still exist in these areas. whereas they're disappearing from the rest of the city. So anyway, this just comes back. It just seems to appear that there is an untapped connection between the urban informal sector and sustainable food. They usually rural migrants, so they have knowledge of farming. A lot of them grow their own herbs and vegetables. There is a lot of reduction in wastage and much more diversity of food because they use a lot of parts of vegetables that are not used by regular urban folk, using leaves or flowers or seeds and peels of certain plants. And also they, engage in a lot of preservation and drying of foods, which is something that, urban youth you can't even conceive of urban youth doing this anymore. And also there's making a lot of cheap, freshly cooked food available to migrant workers. So there seems to be like, there is something waiting to happen where, they can play a larger role in the food systems in the city if one were able to reconceptualize something. So I want to just end the talk with bringing up the concept of urbanization that was coined by architect and visionary Tay Kheng Soon in Singapore in almost I think as far back as the 1970s, where he was propounding that we need to reconceptualize human habitat so that the dichotomy between the city and the countryside disappears. And we need to create a hybrid of urban and rural, which coexist together in order to have greater social, cultural, and environmental justice. So I think there's a very powerful idea. A lot of the initiatives that I've shared today tie back in some way to this idea, which is quite a powerful paradigm shift for the future of our habitat. So I'm going to end there. That's all from me. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Parul.
Did I do good on time? I was trying to do it in 25 minutes, but I'm not sure how much time I took.
I think you were on time. Thank you.
Okay.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful, the spectrum that you showcased. The entire idea of a city and food. Yeah, liked it. Thank you.
Good. You'll have to help me stop sharing.
I'll do that.
Shweta?
I'll do that. Yeah.
Shweta, could you?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. That was really lovely.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Anaga and Dia, you can proceed. Now we'd like to call upon the second speaker, architect Abhijna Ramachandran. Architect Abhijna believes the approach of design informed by the integration of natural process and cultural network. She is practically interested in the in architecture from Oslo School of Architecture and Design with landscape urbanism as her focus. After working a short time with integrated design in Bangalore, she is now based in London and works for Todd Longstaff Govind Landscape Studios. We have touched to have her here and would like to welcome her to the as our second speaker.
Thanks, Dia. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, I presume everyone can see my screen. So I'm just going to go right into it. Okay. So the overarching topic of this presentation is water and human settlement. Historically, water has always played an important role in habitation. People went to where there was water. Today, we bring water to us. In this epoch of global warming, this is and will continue to be the most precious element. In Indian cities like Bangalore, seasonal drought and flooding are the most common urban problematics. As urban practitioners of the built environment, we not only have to address the fluctuation of excess and shortage, but also adapt to the intensification of this flux due to the changing climate. It is the call of our times, after all. A water-sensitive approach to planning cities is the way forward, and let's kind of explore that in the case of Bangalore. So to set the scene, let's look at the bigger picture of water flow in the subcontinent. In the north, we have perennial flows of water that's sourced by meltwater from the Himalayas and rainfall. And in the south, we have seasonal flows that are dependent on the monsoon rain. Historically, settlements and civilizations came up along water. These settlements grew into cities that flourished as port cities along seacoasts like Mumbai and Chennai, or agricultural cities along fertile plains and deltas of river basins like Dhaka, for example. And Bangalore, as you can see, is neither by the coast nor is it close to a large water source. So in the case of Bangalore, Bangalore is located on the watershed of two principal river basins. So it's located on the ridge, which means that any rainfall that falls in this region flows away from this ridge. The main ridge divides the region into two topographical regions. This used to be colloquially called as Malnadu, and the right was colloquially called as Bayalu, or the Maidan. And this kind of, we need to notice that even the micro kind of geography of the area was recognized. And this was the windward side of the monsoon rain, and this was the leeward side. So four catchment systems of water radiated from this ridge. So the region had an undulating topography made up of hills and valleys. Sorry. So made up of hills and valleys, and the granitic geology combined with this possible for collecting and managing rainwater. And this was done by constructing an extensive system of tanks in the city, man-made tanks, a system that kind of got activated when the monsoon came. So founded on this system, the cluster of settlements that then became the city solely depended on these numerous tanks for their water needs. And here, the landscape was the initiator of settlement. A tank, or kere in Kannada, is what is formed by constructing an embankment between two high grounds to collect water in a low ground or a depression. And we all know Alsur tank, and this is the bund that holds the water. The position of this embankment is crucial to the tank. The water is seasonal, but the bund is ever present. The entire system was a cascading one where water overflowed from one tank to the other. The mechanism of saturating and overflow of water was this of habitation was structured system, and each tank was spatio-temporally variant. Water was controlled by sluice gates and used for cultivation. The wetlands were the irrigated areas, and the dry lands became gardens. Crops were grown accordingly. So rice and paddy was cultivated in the part that could be irrigated, and ragi and millets, which are drier crops, were cultivated on the tank bed where the waters had receded. So when the water receded, after consumption or evaporation, The silt would be used for crops to fertilize crops in the wetland, and greens were collected from the tank bed and were used for cooking, or animals used to graze in the tank bed. The clay was harvested to make utensils and other things. So this landscape was like a continuous system of some kind of use. So today's scenario, coming back to the present, it's a very different system now. In the last 40 years, the number of tanks, anybody who's been living in the city knows that the number of tanks have drastically reduced. The tank beds have been filled up, high grounds or hills have been flattened. We no longer look at Bangalore as having two types of topography. The remaining tanks have become isolated. No one has access to these tank beds. They're expected to look full throughout the year and have been like reduced to mere ornaments in the city's landscape. The canals have become the city's stormwater and sewage system. So there's been a shift in our relationship with the system. Something that was devised to hold every drop of rain in the landscape is now trying to get out water and whatnot away from the city as quick as possible. And Bangalore's water supply now comes from a river that's hundreds of kilometers away and located at least 300 meters below it. So a massive amount of energy goes into supplying water to the city. And as we know, Kaveri itself is a seasonal river. So this is causing an imbalance in the demand supply of water to the city. So when piped water becomes unreliable, we turn to groundwater. And these days, bore wells go about 500 meters deep in search of water to extract water from the deep aquifers. In short, this whole system today is unsustainable. So Bangalore's system, its water system, has evolved from depending on hundreds of constructed tanks within the city to now piping water from a single water source from outside the city. And this is a story in most towns towns and cities in South India: Hyderabad, Chennai, Coimbatore, Hampi, Madurai. What has changed along the way? There might be many factors. One is population growth and unchecked urbanization that has led to a weak urban tissue, lack of understanding of the water tanks, or the working of the tanks, in fact, and the appreciation of the terrain, building on low grounds or encroachment of tanks, long periods of very little rainfall, the governance, etc. There's not one reason, in fact. But I want to bring our attention to what may be the underlying problem in all this, which is how we visualize and engage with water. So very quickly, this is the palimpsest of the city. So I'm just going to talk about the evolution of water tanks. Between the 1830s and 1880s, there was an increase in the number of water tanks. So due to population growth, the people in the city added more tanks, and that supplied water. But then between 88 and 92, this is 1888 and 1892, there was a period of successive drought. And Alsur tank was enlarged, and then a number of tanks were deepened, like Sankey tank and Miller's tank, but that wasn't enough. So that was in 1892 was the first time when water was piped into the city. A trade agreement was made between the Mysore Maharaja, who was a big proponent of modernization back then, and the British. And so the British introduced their twin formulae of piped water and sewage in the city. So this, we can say, was probably the turning point of the language of water in the city. The entire narrative changed. So when the water kind of from life-giving, it became a source of pollution, and and tanks which were visible physical expressions of water resource in the landscape within the city was replaced by piped water that nobody really had a relation to. So this distance kind of brought in a disconnect. Pipes also kind of straightened up our roads, as we can see. In the beginning, the roads were radial, in keeping with the structure of the system. A few more points to add is that post-colonial era, there was a further decline in tanks because, long story short, the maintenance of the tanks were based on land tenure system. And after independence, there was an abolition act, the Lanternia Abolition Act, and the whole system became centralized. So something that was local and maintained by smaller communities went to the central government, went to departments that were kind of continued from the colonial times. So it went to the irrigation department. And then after that, in '86, it was taken over by the forest department, who looked at these working systems of tanks and carries as lakes, which I think may also be another problem. So how we engage with this, how we look at these water systems in our landscape changed. And another thing is how we visualize water. And here I'd like to mention landscape architects Anuradha Mathur and Dilip Dikuna. They work between Bangalore and Philadelphia, and they've done extensive, excellent work on how we visualize and represent and design in a terrain of water. So they trace it back to centuries, ever since primitive world maps started being drawn. But let's consider it in the context of the beginning of cartography in the subcontinent. So British surveyors carried out an extensive survey of India, and this was the first time the geography of the subcontinent began to be documented in the form of maps. Until then, it was stories, myths, and written texts about where a river came from. A line was drawn to indicate rivers. The colonial eye reinforced this thinking of rivers as lines, indicating a start, an end, and restricting water to defined widths, drawing lines for course separating land and water. These maps were drawn, although for the purposes of administration, have evolved into maps that today we use to inform design. Echoing the words of Anuradha Mathur and Dilip Dikuna, flooding is nothing but water crossing a line that has been drawn by man. So flooding is an ecologically important characteristic of water. But then when you put man there, it becomes a disaster. It's this line, this act of separation that causes conditions of excess and scarcity. So the tidy line that defies the ubiquitous wetness. In terms of visualizing, I'd like to take us back to how we learned the hydrological cycle when we were in school, which is evaporation, cloud formation, precipitation, and surface flow. And Mathur and Dikuna say that right now, the way we're designing is with surface flow as our moment of reality. And they urge us to look at precipitation, not just precipitation in terms of rain, mist, dew, cyclone, storms, hail, snow, and surface flow. So they want us to look at this entire thing as our moment of reality, which might change the way we approach design. Accepting rain and how it interacts with the terrain, so that water floods and recedes, evaporates, saturates, soaks, flows. And not only does water flow, but with it, minerals and material deposits like clay and silt, etc. The seasonality, accepting seasonality of water, that it's not always present. And in the case of Bangalore, I think landscape terminology becomes pertinent, because calling it lakes instead of keres or tanks kind of strips the productive quality of this landscape and makes it, and makes it just an ornament in the landscape. And lakes have this connotation of naturally existing structures through the landscape, and this expectation of appearing full throughout the year. So I'd like to conclude by saying that recognizing the city as a city of tanks instead, rather than a city of lakes, kind of helps us make this relationship with rain. So the city fabric has a relationship with rain and hence seasonality. So creating a constructive interplay between the ecology and urban structures will help create more opportunities for us to thrive. And yeah, so we may say that it used to be a completely different lifestyle before. They were more agrarian, and now it's more urban. We have more population now. But while that's true, what I would like to say is maybe we need to take a farmer's approach to this whole thing. A farmer is so clued into the hydrological cycle, his vocabulary is in terms of rain and water storage, soil, crops, vegetation. And maybe that's how we need to approach urban design in the city. And with this precedent, what I find refreshing is that man intervenes with the natural environment, not to destroy it, but in fact to enhance it. I'd like to leave that thought with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a nice tale about relooking at the idea of Bangalore. Thanks.
Thank you.
Actually, currently the conversation is going about the idea of productive landscapes. I think you people will know about it much better than I do. That's a current conversation, and you would also probably know about a lady called Harini Nagendra. She's an environmentalist, based out of Azim Premji. Currently based out of Azim Premji. She is she's majorly in this.
Yeah, correct. I have I've been following her work actually.
A couple of places where Parul had talked about the idea of productive lower economic settlements, like growing a plant for food and all that. No, one of her students, PhD students, has actually sat down and documented it. And there's another lady from Isaac. I've forgotten her name. Her student was also sitting down and documenting, but she was documenting the fruit-bearing trees, and that kind of stuff. They're fascinating to talk to.
That's the thing. I think what they're trying to kind of look at is this Indian idea of tota, which is also a productive landscape. But I think these days, with the change of landscape terminology, we call it a garden. And I think garden has this kind of connotation of
it is courtesy the British. It's courtesy the British. Courtesy the grass and the flowering plants from the British. Courtesy the British.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It was nice listening to you. Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm sure there were a lot of takeaways for all of us. I would now like to introduce to you the third speaker of the day, architect Sayali Lokare, urban designer and environmental planner, is currently a GIS analyst. Over the various professional roles she has held in the last few years, the common thread has been a deep curiosity to learn more about how our cities function and operate, also how we can make them more livable, inclusive, and equitable. Believing in a multidisciplinary approach to urban planning, she tries to share knowledge with a range of people from sociologists and behavioral scientists to computer programmers. Holding an undergraduate degree from RV College of Architecture and a master's in environmental planning from University of California, Berkeley, she is currently a part of the product development team at Fracta AI, a company that uses machine learning and maps to help American water utilities assess the risk on their service delivery infrastructure and provide decision for making tools. We are honored to have you here, ma'am.
Thanks, Anuradha. Okay, so let me try sharing my screen now. Let's see. Okay. Is everyone able to see the slide? It's called Befriending the Bureaucracy.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me here, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I think it's one of the first times I'm putting this talk together, just stringing different projects in my experience along. So just bear with me if I go on any tangents. So the talk is called Befriending the Bureaucracy, and from my conversation with Shweta and Anuradha ma'am, what I realized is a large part of our training as design students is really focused on cultivating the creative process. But in practice, as urban professionals in interacting with whichever part of the urban realm, more than half of our time can be spent navigating what we famously call the system. The bureaucracy, the dark dreaded corridors of file shifting, permit granting, and compliance heavy government offices. And we all don't really like to talk about it, but we all very much know that it exists. So that's how most of us tend to think of the word bureaucracy. And even if we look at some of the dictionary meanings, so this one is from the Cambridge Dictionary, and it says a system for controlling or managing a country, company, or organization that is operated by a large number of officials employed to follow rules carefully. And so most definitions that I looked up, they already have sort of a tone of disappointment to it. And this one even says like mainly disapproving. So it's not surprising that the common feeling that this word bureaucracy generates in most of us is something that looks like this. You have a confusing maze of offices and officials to navigate to get this one building permit before you even get to the design phase, which is it's the purpose of our profession, right? So and this is what also makes us more and more reluctant to engage with the bureaucracy. And unfortunately, if you are an architect, or urban designer, or urban planner, you know that bureaucracy of public administration is pretty much inevitable in the profession. So what is bureaucracy? How exactly does it matter to some in construction? And these are, I think, the two main questions that seem to sum up my professional journey so far. And I'm going to take you through some projects that really helped me answer them and explore them more. Okay. So the very first project I want to talk about is called the Streets for People by the People workshop. It wasn't a big project, it was just a week-long workshop. And I did this, I was involved in this when I was a baby architect fresh out of college. And I did it while I was working for Prasanna Desai Architects in Pune. And I'm still amazed at the kind of confidence that, PD sir sort of put in us to be an active part of such processes. So this project, in fact, was just a week-long workshop. It was done by PDA in collaboration with students from PPP COA. That's a College of Architecture in Pune, and a bunch of other organizations. And we worked on the Aund ward in Pune city. So it was a fairly small scope. And the idea was to guide a group of design students to understand, the concept of complete streets, and then also have them engage with the citizens and finally design proposals for the ward to improve transportation for all kinds of stakeholders. So cyclists, pedestrians, shift the focus from a car-centric approach. And if you've ever come across the word of PDA, Prasanna Desai sir gives beautiful presentations. They've been advocating for this kind of work for many, many years now. So like I said, although the actual workshop was only 1 week long, the whole process from start to finish took around 6 or more weeks to put together. And it started with, formulating workshop objectives, introducing the concepts to students, reaching out to residents and stakeholders through, community meetings and awareness presentations, doing actual transact walks with the residents, to take back their feedback, and sort of start conceptualizing design proposals from that, document the whole, basically document the whole precinct of the scope, then evaluate it as per, we use the Comprehensive Mobility Plan of Pune as the basic policy document for guidance. But, in any sort of planning project, I think this is a big part that comes, that goes hand in hand with doing your design proposals. And then came the actual design proposals. Then we did a public exhibition and press outreach. So a lot of steps sort of, went into this. And as you can see, the design and, the documentation were only 2 steps out of the whole process that took place. So the most of the other things that were key to getting to the design phase actually involved building collaborations with other organizations, coming to a consensus on the objective, reaching out to residents, getting local representatives on board. That was a big one. And finally, displaying the work back to the community. And then this is a chart of the organizations that were involved. You can see that there were a few NGOs, there were resident organizations, and there were also public representatives that we had to engage. So for me personally, 3 key experiences really came out of this process. And my time at PDA in general, I think this is just a snapshot of what I did there for about 2 years. So the first one is pitching the pilot and recognizing decision makers. And this was a very big sort of step in, we do have a very keen and deep understanding as design professionals about, like Abhijna just presented, about how, our relationship with ecology or our relationship with the urban environment is actually structured, but communicating that to somebody who has the power to make a decision, I think that was a skill that was extremely important, that I really picked up while I was working at PDA. The second one was working with other organizations and, just realizing the value of knowledge from other disciplines, and, what collaboration brings to the table. And I remember while we were sort of at the table, discussing the objectives for this workshop with CE, Subnet, they brought a knowledge about participatory budgeting and the PMC budget in general that was so key to this process. And, it was a very thick couple of books that, in very, very tiny font that they really knew in and out of. And so it's rarely possible for a single person or organization to hold that kind of, overarching expertise together. And the third key takeaway from this experience was the citizen engagement and democracy in decision making. And, you really get to see up close why such a lengthy process, things that we call red tape and, compliance and, document filing, all of this, why is it justified? And, how public administrations are really accountable for much more than just, just optimizing for one variable, right? They have to take in many, many things into account, and a lot of strings are being, a lot of strings are pulling the process, which takes, this amount of time. So, let's just keep those three learnings in mind, and I'm going to go through the next project. And I think, once I finish with that, we'll sort of try and bring all of this back into what it means to us as urban professionals. So the second project I will be talking about is my master's thesis, and it was also on urban flooding in Bangalore. So I'm really glad that Abhijna really set the stage for it. So I'm not going to go through any of the ecological, setting of why this phenomenon happens. She's gone through a lot of that understanding with us. My thesis actually took around 1.5 years. And again, I don't have an inspiring story of why I chose this. It's just that, if the city you grew up in floods every other year, it's kind of hard to ignore that issue. So the central question of this thesis was, can we look at flood production not just as an ecological process, but as a socio-ecological process? Which means, laying emphasis on the social behavior side that contributes to flood production. besides the physical mappable factors like, elevation, streams, tanks, etc. So now, I'll focus just on the social part, the part of my thesis that dealt with the social factors. And I also only conducted the project for the Madiwala watershed. So like Abhijna sort of went over, I think this is the main ridge that she talked about. And if you look at just the jurisdictional boundary for Bangalore, it's split into quite a few watersheds. So I just looked at the largest Madiwala watershed here. That helped me limit the scope. And the main part of my thesis was about trying to understand how do bureaucrats make decisions about stormwater. And that involved, going and talking to them and doing structured interviews, not just with the bureaucrats, but also with the residents that, interact with the bureaucracy. And the objective of this understanding was, a little ambitious. I was trying to map this behavior over a physical geography and then, see if I could use that to inform policy recommendations and design proposals. So for example, which corporator is the best at complying with all the regulations? And of course, I'm simplifying this a lot, but just to get us an idea, of it. And also which corporator is creatively pushing those regulations to the edge, which is something I found increasingly more in my interviews. And, during those interviews, I saw all kinds of variations in handling the Rajakal ways and the, compliance or, the requirements for compliance. I think the NGT is the NGT, I think, order. Yeah, the NGT order is, I think, the main one that they followed for the buffer zones and all of that. So, they guided them under roads, they turned them towards lakes, they made some really clever land negotiations to create buffer zones. And in some cases, there was also failure to, meet with these compliances. So this is a little bit more in depth of the process that went into understanding. So, this was a part of my research that, this kind of research methodology was very new to me, being an architect. It's a very behavioral sciences, sociology side of research. So I had to do a sampling and selection for who I'm going to interview. So I used a snowball sampling method, which just means that, I rely on the one contact that I know to put me in touch with other people. Then I prepared the interview keys. I conducted the interviews and transcribed them. And then the final portion was I synthesized this information using Michael Lipsky's book as the backbone for the analysis. And this is a small chart of just the governance, the stormwater governance system that I charted as I went along with these interviews and the information that I got from various participants. Michael Lipsky is a scholar with a background in politics, behavioral science, and policy. And in his book, Street Level Bureaucracy, he argues that policy implementation in the end comes down to the people who actually implement it. He argued that the state employees like police and social workers, and in this case, stormwater engineers, should be seen as a part of the policy-making community and as exercisers of political power. So I used his framework as a way of understanding the decision that these officials were making. And in the end, I could narrow it down to 4 main behavioral characteristics that drove their decisions in terms of stormwater. One was the frequency of client interactions. The second was dissent. So this is, where they handle conflicting facts like NGT compliances, and then, what if there's an on-ground settlement in the buffer zone you're supposed to clear. Discretion, how much or when to intervene, and rationing of services, which is how and where to stretch the limited resources that they have to implement all of this. And through this exercise, I was able to actually go one step further into getting a very strong handle on who it really is that sits behind that file fill desk. So here is a fun cartoon by a social worker turned cartoonist, Fran Orford, and I'll give you a second to read it. So similar to this cartoon, through my study, I noticed that often bureaucracy and bureaucrats function on some very different philosophies. And the bureaucracy as an organization is very loyal to its rule-making, compliance-heavy, personality. But the bureaucrat is in fact trying to exercise a lot of creativity in dealing with what is thrust upon them from the top. So, is this creativity the most equitable or ecologically sound? Sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes it's no, yeah, a very resounding no, but all the same, that window of creativity still exists. So here I just want to take a moment and a pause to think of what these two projects bring us to. And it basically gives us an insight or a preview into how organizations and the bureaucrats work. And it's understanding the capabilities and limitations of the bureaucrat, and also taking a minute to appreciate that, we aren't all underwater yet, which means although there are a million things that do not work, there are still some ways in which people are able to exercise influence. In some cases with, like I said, a lot of, impromptu creativity in the right direction. And although a lot is dictated by compliance and red tape, there are pieces of the puzzle that can still be filled in with some discretion. And we as planners and designers can capture that window of possibility when it comes to engaging with the system. And hopefully we all go home not feeling like this is how much we matter in an organization. Okay. So coming to the final part of the project, a year after I graduated from my master's program, I began working for Fracta AI. So that's the company I'm with now. And Fracta is a tech startup that uses machine learning to predict breaks on drinking water pipes. It builds applications for water auditing, identifying water loss for any given utility. So we work with all sizes of utilities across the US. So right from a large city like Boston to smaller towns like Tacoma. And my role at the company sits between these two departments. So between the engineering department that actually builds these applications and the sales department that markets these to customers. I spend a large part of my time on a daily basis interacting with water engineers, water managers, and various other officials to either pitch the product and identify their operational gaps, which means I get to ask them a lot of questions about how the organization functions and who holds the power to call the shots. The process, the other part of my job is also to process their data. So I get to I get an insight into how they document their data, how they think about their data, and then collect feedback, if they're already a customer with us. And then I get to synthesize this feedback and data into better product features to build with the engineering team. So, somewhere here I can see all the skills that I have sort of gathered over the last couple of years being used to do my job. So, that's why I thought it was a fascinating sort of endpoint to come to after talking about the last two projects. So after completing about a year and a half in this role, the learnings that have started to emerge are now related to understanding how organizations behave as a whole. They have a lot to be accountable for, and unfortunately, they cannot function on a simplistic ethos of customer first, which is a lot of what private sector organizations do. Comparisons across different kinds of bureaucracies, how they operate, who calls the shots, who does the groundwork, and how does utility structure, scope, and funding change over time? These are some exciting new questions that come up. And all in all, I can say that in 8 years of studying bureaucracies, they've proven to be anything but boring. So I would like to end this presentation with a quote by Henry Lefebvre. I used his research back in for undergrad for my thesis. And I realize now that this quote might be a little unrelated and abrupt, but you know what, it's too late to change it. Anyway, so this quote says that it is to be noted that a deserted street at 4 o'clock in the afternoon has as strong a significance as the swarming of a square at market or meeting times. And it talks about a very important skill that I unknowingly polished for 5 years in architecture school, which is the skill of observation. That we're taught to listen and see things that others do not perceive easily. And that skills like these often help you make sense of things that are beyond the confines of design alone. Thank you.
Sayali, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it just because you're telling the students that we as designers are participants in the world context, and there are many other people who have a say in how and why we design. Thank you. It was fun. It was fun for me to listen to. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you, Mom. That was a very interesting one. Coming towards the end of the presentations today, I would now like to introduce to you the moderator of the day, architect Shalini Prakash, graduated from RV College of Architecture and went on to pursue her master's in landscape architecture at CEPT University, Ahmedabad. As a landscape architect and a researcher, Shalini ma'am has undertaken work of varied nature. She worked with architect Prabhakar Bhagwat, Ahmedabad, where she not only guided conversations pertaining to design commissions, but also has an active part in research and documentation undertaken by the LEAF. Most recently, she has started teaching at RV College of Architecture, Bangalore. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Anuradha. So I'd like to thank all the speakers, Parul, Abhijna, and Sayali, for the highly evocative discourses. It sort of effectively urges one to revisit the basic relationship of human beings with natural features. And as architects, I think it also translates into being informed by our land topography, water, and food systems in our design interventions across all scales.
Shalini, sorry to interrupt. Could you switch on your video, please?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Yeah. So we spoke about socio-cultural relationships with natural elements like water. So I think Abhijna also mentioned the associations that one has with these repetitive rhythms of nature, like hydrological cycles and these cyclical phenomena. So I'd like to just open up a discussion about this association that you mentioned. So these associations are fairly easy to keep up with in a rural landscape, given the proximity of the landscape with the settlement. So how would these associations translate into an urban setting? So would the natural element itself become something different for you? Or, or would it be more layered because there's a lot more happening in an urban space as opposed to a rural setup? So, yeah.
Well, I think, yeah, of course, in a rural context, you do have what the idea of everyone thinks the landscape is, right? It's easier to perceive landscape in a rural setup, I would say, because you come out of at your doorstep, you can look at fields and hills and, probably a river or something like that. But I would like to say that urban centers, cities themselves have a lot of ecology in it. And that is what we need to kind of exaggerate, I would say. That's the importance that we need to give. And what I also want to add is that in like further designing our cities, if we kind of, as practitioners of the built environment, if we keep that in mind, and like I mentioned at the end of my presentation, that's the approach we probably need to take in order to kind of create that landscape in urban centers. It's the point of view of a farmer maybe who thinks in terms of plants and soil and water, and kind of bringing that landscape. So I mean, in a city, what I think landscape itself is of a different nature, you can say. So in Bangalore, it's your lakes, it's just your avenue trees, or things like that. So I guess, yeah, that's probably my answer. I don't know if I've answered your question properly, but let's listen to the others.
I think I want to, sort of piggyback on what Abhijna said. And I was also thinking of this while Abhijna was giving her talk, is the relationship that, especially from my study with the bureaucrats, what like Abhijna said was 100% true, is the way that these people talk about water and, the vocabulary they use, the maps, even the way they document their data, I think is, very reflective of how that relationship has changed. And I found something very exciting, when you said you take a farmer's approach to connecting to water and the landscape and sort of bring that, because effectively the way the farmers think about tanks is, that whole expanding, contracting thing. They take it as a very sort of accepted fact of what the lake is going to do, what the tank is going to do. But, when it comes to government bodies, they actually really look at them as, bounded assets, something that has a boundary, just like a property, because it's easier for them to document and keep track of. So, that whole flexibility of maybe the lake will, be this large one rainy season and not that large is like, I think, very daunting for, administrations that want to reduce their workload, right? They don't want to think too deeply about these things. They don't have the time to, rather, like, I wouldn't blame them, but, like connecting those two approaches, I think would really be beneficial.
And I think now, like in Mumbai and Bangalore and even Chennai, it's like this whole idea of a lake view house or a apartment, and it's like commodifying these entities in the city, which is also becoming a problem. So when you offer a lake view apartment to someone, you expect the lake to be full of water, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually found that a very strong statement, what you ended with, Abhijna, that, just trying to think of a shift, not thinking of it as a lake, but as a reservoir, where really there is a huge mental shift between the two terms. Because like you said, the lake, you almost feel like the water is coming from the ground, whereas you don't actually realize that it's a reservoir for water coming in from various sources. And I think that's why I find this whole, it's about bringing about a paradigm shift in our mental frameworks, whether it comes to water or bureaucracy, or the concept of urbanization, for that matter, which talks about how life in cities is as unjust as in rural areas. Rural areas are not the central focus of our development strategies. But they are living in a natural setting, which is something that should be available to every human being. Whereas when we live in cities, we think we are living great lives and we have all the trappings of a modern life, but we are bereft of a lot of interaction with nature. And perhaps, it's about trying to understand that. How rich is your life really? For the lack of natural elements.
It is, to think about it that way, like even urbanization, it's like it involves a lot of unlearning of what we already know. And I think that's what I find difficult in my approach, like to design. We're aware of something, but then to unlearn how you look at water, because our minds are so conditioned to looking at tanks or lakes as something that kind of occupies a surface, and to design at that kind of interface is something I'm finding very difficult, actually. And I guess that's how it is. It takes time. Everything takes time to understand.
Yeah.
to kind of like bring the rural into the city, and how you ended your presentation with, it's to diffuse boundaries.
Yeah. Also, to be in tune with nature, I think part of our failing is the fact that we think electricity comes from a switch, and food is in the refrigerator, and water comes from just a tap, and you never really think of the externalities of where it's coming from and where our I keep thinking we have a waste disposal system because my rubbish gets collected by somebody, but eventually we don't know where it's going. It's probably getting dumped somewhere, into a landfill or whatever. We have no idea. It's not a system really until there is an end game involved. So it's just the interconnectedness of things that kind of.
Yeah. Thank you for the inputs. Shweta,
actually, at this point, I would actually like, I'm really happy and glad that we have an expert on this subject with us today on the platform, architect Vishwanath. Hello, sir.
Yeah, hi. I'm not an architect. I'm a civil engineer.
Sorry. Yes, sir. Sorry. So if you could just say a few words.
But you're partnering with an architectural firm, right? The biome is actually working. Yeah.
Sorry for that. It was just. Sorry.
Yeah. So I thoroughly enjoyed all the three presentations. Yeah, thoroughly enjoyed it, and it was wonderful. I learned so much from Shanghai, from Bangalore, and from the bureaucratic angle also, and so from Sayali's presentation from Pune, and how the everyday politics of things, the tyranny of small decisions leads to the construction of cities and spaces. That's fascinating. Just had one comment for Abhijna. Groundwater is missing, Abhijna, in your presentation, and even in the Gerard and the book itself. India is a groundwater civilization. We are the world's largest user of groundwater. Somehow that doesn't feature because it's invisible, right? So while we try to make water amorphous and not draw lines, we simply forget a huge major chunk of our resource. So that was something striking for me, and I don't know how it is. The other thing for Parul also is that Bangalore is running a huge, one of the world's largest transfer of treated wastewater for agricultural reuse, right? So the farmers are being engaged. Areas of the hinterland are made drought-proof and climate change-proof, and the food security of the city is being reconsidered by shipping out wastewater with nutrients and making sure that up to 100 kilometers, more than 500 lakes are getting filled. Farmers are small and marginal farmers are then bringing the food back to the city, closing the loop, right? So some fascinating experiments are also going on at different scales. So very interesting. I'm sure that.
You could also talk, Vishwanath, you could also talk about the open well project that you're running. I find it even more fascinating. I find it really, really fascinating because you're talking about collecting water at the same place.
Look, for a change, this was not a manel, this was a female. So let not the man jump in and start to talk about 10,000 things that are there. A brief introduction was called for. I've done that brief introduction. I'd like the spotlight on the three speakers and more of the audience to interact with it. Good luck with the show. And Anuradha, I can do a talk on it anytime you want me to later on.
Thank you. Please, you're welcome. You're welcome. The three of you can, Sayali and Abhijna, you can also look at the other idea which has come from China, what they talk about, the idea of sponge cities. The idea of leaving water to stay as a swale is what they call it, so that when the water is not there, it becomes a landscape area. But when the water comes as rain, it stays over there and it gets percolated. Most of the time, the tanks in Bangalore, I will call it by that word that you are talking about, the Kere and the tank in Bangalore, did that same occupation. It was locals saving of water so that the groundwater could kind of get replenished, if I can put it that way. Yeah. And that's my 2 bits. I enjoyed the complexity that all of you raised. It was nice. It was very, very nice. Thank you. Sayali, just one question. You can also try and address the land forming issues that we architects and engineers and all of us do as urban planners. We go to an empty piece of land, and there's a fascinating example for me in Bombay, because I used to live at Pune, and traveling to Bombay, we could see a hill. One fine day, we generally sleep those 3 hours, and you wake up at that point when you're just walking into CBD, and we looked up and we said the hill has disappeared. They just flattened it. And that also has an implication of the idea of water and the lake systems that you people are talking about. And the Nala, the Kalwe, everything gets changed. I mean, as engineers, we have the capacity for changing so much that we should realize how much to change and why we change.
Yeah.
Because you are talking, Sayali, especially you are talking about very large systems. And they are majorly, how do I put it? Transformers, basically.
Yeah, I don't know if Abhijna is, you are more into the profession of landscape architecture, but, even while I was at Berkeley, I took some landscape architecture courses where if you're going through the costing and the estimates, groundwork is one of the costliest things that you put on there. The cubic feet of land and soil that you move is fascinating. Like here, especially when I go around, I think America is this, I don't know how really to feel about it, the highway system that they have, but the amount of, like manual contouring that they have done to have that system in place is amazing. You just feel like, oh, they have created these landscapes. It's a little scary, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I agree actually, because even here I'm practicing in London right now. So even here, if we want to reduce the cost of the project, we have to kind of work with the terrain, reduce the cutting and filling of land, and just work with what we have, basically.
Padmavati, would you like to add something to this?
Yeah, I live in Kormangla, and for 20 years, there has been this little pit sort of thing in front of my house. And I just let it be while all the neighbors around the place were digging bore wells and God knows what all. And this is not very deep. It's just about, I think, 6 feet deep. For 20 years, it has always had water. Okay, I have seen the National Games Village come up in a place where there used to be a lake. I saw it turning into a swamp. I saw it being taken over. I saw the Shirke constructions, cranes over there building the Asiatic Games, Asian Games Village. And then it became the National Games Village. So I think, and now, horror of horrors, there are residents and there are political creatures as part of that group who have come up with one hell of a fantastic idea that they will pump all the stormwater drain back down into the earth where the aquifers are. Do you have any opinion about this? Have you heard about this? Is this gaining ground? To me, my gut level, I have no technical expertise, but I'm someone who's worked from my gut, and it's worked for me so far. Environmentally, it has worked over the decades. And I'm saying this is a horror that's waiting to be unleashed. And where there are political creatures involved, I can see it just might happen. It doesn't take 20 years for them to solve a drainage issue. 20 years, this lane of mine has got flooded, right? And every time they come up enthusiastically, and then residents also, I mean, we believe, right? We believe in hope. We believe that we are working towards the enhancement of the urban area. But lo and behold, again, there's something wrong with what has been decided on by the best of engineers employed by the BDA and the Public Works Department, I'm sure. But ground reality, 20 years, this lane is still flooding. So when the municipal corporation people come, I give them a mouthful. But it ends there because nothing else works either. Yeah. So if you want to comment on that. Especially the groundwater, that Vishwanath was also talking about. Because this seems to be groundwater and it's been there 20 years. It's been there. I mean, I've had water in that little pit.
I think about pumping stormwater into like through a bore well. Is that what you said? Actually pumping it back. I think Vishwanath sir is better placed to answer the question. I don't know if it's a good thing. The only thing I can think of is like sending polluted water down. Is that a good idea? I'm not sure.
It's like,
actually, I don't know.
To my layperson's brain, it is like a horror.
Yeah. I grew up in Kormangla as well, and our street used to flood all the time. Every time there was a little bit of heavy rain, it flooded. And my parents would always get worried. And our underground sump would get filled up with water, and I used to climb down and clean it up the next day.
All my furniture has moved to a height. And I'm actually thinking of selling the house because I don't enjoy the rain anymore. When I hear the rain, I used to love the rain. And now I say, you know what? Oh no, it's raining. And then I go through this exercise of, putting the chairs on the sofas and I have all dismantleable stuff. So everything goes in 5 minutes. Everything's at a higher level. And I've adapted to it, but I know I can't keep doing it. I mean, and so I am going to sell my house.
I think if I'm not wrong, I think Kormangla itself was a tank bed, and that's why. And I definitely lived in a low-lying area, and I knew that, and that's why it always got flooded.
So the BDA had no business declaring it as a residential area. I mean, residents. When I came to buy that site, I didn't know about this. It was only after I bought it, then I saw that there was a lake that was turning into a swamp, and then, the Shirkes had moved in by then.
They tried to repair it as well. I think there was a tank sort of a thing that they tried to build near BDA complex, where they diverted all the stormwater into the tank. I don't know, there was a plant nursery there, and then there was a small tank behind. It was already encroached by some builders. There were already apartments, but what was remaining of the land, they dug it up a little more, lined it with stone and everything, made it a park around, and they diverted all the stormwater in the surrounding areas into that tank. This was happening, I think, before I left Bangalore. So I need to go back and see what happens when it rains and if it's actually taking care of something around. But yeah.
I was just wondering, so this is a good moment to get in and ask about the civic initiatives that Parul mentioned, and then Sayali also talked about a bit, right, in the projects. And Abhijna too, would you like to comment? I mean, where are obviously there's some gap between what people want and there's some misinformation. So there are all kinds of gaps, right? And that's why we see these kinds of things happening again and again. It's not like it's new. The BDA has been, it's been a policy of the government to kind of fill up lakes or take lakes over and then build big projects on them. So then where do you think, how does that, I mean, is there any possibility of any gaps being filled, of misinformation or anything else? How do citizen inputs actually finally go back to the government in meaningful ways where something can actually happen? What did you think from what you saw, Parul, with the food systems and the initiatives that you were talking about? And then maybe Sayali and Abhijna can comment on it.
China's not really a role model in getting feedback from the public back to the government. It is an authoritarian regime. And in that sense, they do their job well. These kind of things would not happen. They would have figured out an engineering solution to, if they had to put a residential settlement in a lake, they would have figured out the engineering behind it. And I think things like, the Three Gorges Dam, which is the largest dam in the world, which was made in China. And they say so much earth was displaced to create that dam, and so many villages were displaced that it's actually the amount of soil that was moved to create that water reservoirs has actually slowed down the rotation of the earth by a marginal amount. So, here they can throw enough money to solve these kind of things. So I don't know whether that is a model, that's something that can be replicated anywhere else in the world. It happens very differently with this kind of governance. But civic feedback is non-existent here. So that's, it's a very different kind of a setup.
Just to add to that, Parul, I think that's an amazing point, just looking at the way the political system functions, because I'm sure Abhijna would have also come across this, but the main, the thing that you can't miss when you study stormwater in Bangalore is the land and the stormwater nexus, right? Like Padmavati said that, things are being built on, and like stormwater is being interfered with by, land changes to the land. And when it is, I guess, like when you're living in a, a democracy or a political system that has this kind of, there are many more actors involved in development, the control of land is not with the state alone. It is with all of these actors that, buy and sell land and develop land. So in that way, there's, I think, a really good paper that I used for my thesis, which looked at land violations and how these, even besides the actual BDA doing it, taking up lake beds, buffer zones around the Rajkaluves were sort of taken up by developers and sold at cheaper prices, right? And all of those land violations happened, which the government is now trying to also get back to restore ecological balance. But I think that's just like, that dynamic is very different depending on what structure of government you are in. I think that's a really good point.
Thank you, Sayali. I'd like to open the floor to questions now. There are a lot of questions coming in. I think Vasu has a couple of questions. Hi, Vasu, are you here? Hello.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Okay, so I had a couple of questions. 1 minute, I'm just switching off. Good evening, everybody. So the first question is actually to everybody, to all the panelists, is about how do you think we can sensitize students to water as an element and a system during their formative years of learning? I have another question which is exclusively for Sayali. Probably the others could also answer it. I'll ask that very quickly and then I'll leave this over to you guys. Sayali, this is about how important do you think it is for colleges to participate in projects which benefit the community? And how do you think students can engage with bureaucracy in a more meaningful way?
I'll let everyone answer the first question and then I can get on to the second one.
Sure, sure.
Parul, do you want to go first?
Well, when we were in architecture school, they made it a point to take us on expeditions outside of the city. And we always went to places in the extreme of their climate, So we went to the hills in severe winter and we went to hot, humid, tropical places in, peak of summer. And I think that is a good way to kind of sensitize people to whatever it is that you're trying to do. I don't know what's a way of putting them into an environment of scarcity, I suppose, a trip to a desert, or to media. I know what changed my perception towards water was watching a documentary on this, not a documentary, it was sort of fictionalized documentary where this man is shown taking in 3 or 4 wives just so that, each of them can go and get water in a tank and bring it back home. And that just shocked me. And to such an extent that now when I wash rice and I'm about to throw the water away, I think, oh my God, I should put this somewhere, either in my plants or something, and I can't let it go waste. So I think it's just a matter of, exposing them to something that moves them. And different things move different people. So for me, it was that documentary.
Nice. I think I've seen that documentary as well, but I just can't recall what it's called. Well, with respect to what Vasu asked, I'm not sure. Like I mentioned before, I have been trying to unlearn a lot of things that we just have. Our minds have just been conditioned to that, to looking at things a certain way. And yeah, I guess not accepting certain things and not using language and vocabulary, not taking it for granted. Like my example was exactly like, how paying attention to what has changed, our history, and what has changed over time, like how during the colonial times, how it's affected us. The way we look at landscapes have changed. It's embedded in our culture to kind of respect the land that you're on, and things like that changed, and what a kere is, what it means. It's a productive kind of entity, and if you call it a lake, the entire thing changes. So for me, I think I would say is when I kind of learned about it, I just wish that I had learned to look at things differently from school itself, like not being taught that there is a source of a river and a course of a river and a mouth to the river, but looking at it differently. I think, yeah, that's what I'm still trying to learn.
Thanks, Abhijna.
Over to you, Sayali.
I think that was one of the things I was going to point out was actually looking more keenly at history. Sometimes we leave the ways that we study history, and this is not my main point. I just want to say I agree with you, but the ways that we study history, I think, often are from a more relic perspective. I think something that's happened and gone and it's beautiful and all of that, but it's something that we need to preserve, especially in terms of the way we learned about temple architecture and all of those things, right? We didn't learn about landscape history and how it's changed. And, we are on the same timeline as, the landscape is still changing and we are still a part of it. That continuum is somewhere just we're not aware of that. But something that goes hand in hand, I think, with using history to sensitize students, I think, is also geography. In my, this is something that's just worked for me, but the moment that I started looking at things from a map perspective and, fusing both of those together, I think, and I'm a huge map person, so maybe I'm a little biased here, but, looking at it at that scale and looking at change at that scale is really moving. It really informs it. Looking at that larger picture has always worked a lot better for me than, and I would actually advocate both. So one thing is I would advocate these, for tools that show you the sort of larger picture and where you sit in a context, right? But the second thing that I've also found very helpful is just like being open to human experiences that are very different than yours. Like, for example, just bringing a kind of diversity into the classroom, right? Because a lot of things concepts that you learn to name in architecture school or design school, you're just putting a name to an experience that you have already had. You have already lived beside a lake or a tank that's next to your house. You already have gone through your house flooding, tap water not coming, water shortages, power cuts, all of these things. So I think just bringing that diversity into the classroom in terms of like what students are present. Can you do any kind of, I think, exchange programs? Even I think I would have loved to hear experiences outside the classrooms at RV. Like, when I went, especially when I went for my internship at PDA, and I had people coming from, Delhi and all of these other places in India, listening to their experience was, really pops you out of the bubble. You're like, oh, that's also a way to think about this. So yeah, I think my 2 cents would be, that to sensitize students. And then coming to the question of, helping students, or, how can students engage with bureaucracy? I really feel like, especially after going into these offices and talking to these people, they need the research that's being done in educational institutions. And I'm not saying that in terms of like there's like intellectual incapacity in public administrations. There's just no time. They are dealing with a lot. And for somebody to do this kind of deep research, and bring it to them. And I remember Anuradha ma'am saying few, like at the beginning, that there was a report on Humpy that's collecting dust. And that does tend to happen. But, just I would say that like not really focusing on the final product also, but just the process of engagement, going and talking to these people, understanding how they operate, and, even the community, right? Just that experience is like a really wonderful, eye-opening experience for the students. It really changes the way that they approach design and, any issues that they're trying to solve on ground, right? Instead of coming from a very theory perspective, top down, you start really, acknowledging the ground truths. I don't know if I answered the question, Mathu.
Thank you, Sayali. There's another question from Prasanna Rao sir to you. He's asking you if there's any particular reason why political narration of making decision is missing in your presentation.
Political narration of making decisions.
Making decisions, yeah.
Okay, by that, is it specific to the elected party in power that makes the decisions? Because I'm coming at it from the bureaucrats are the administrative wing. So,
could you, sir.
Shalini, could he ask? I mean, Prasanna, can you ask a question?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Hi. Yes. I think there was one question which I just a little curious to ask you, that when you presented, I think it was more from an angle that how as a technical person you connect with someone who understand that technical person. But when it comes to in India, certain decisions are taken by the political circuits. So I just wondering, what is the learning of decision making while interacting with them?
So I think the one one category of participants that I interacted with that were very close to like the political side of things was the corporators of the ward, because at the end of the day, they are elected officials, so they are answerable to they have these two forces, right? People who elected them and the parties who they're a part of. And so I saw really fascinating kind of decision making there. For example, one of the corporators I spoke to, they belonged to a major political party, but the party at the center, elected center for BBMP, I think was different. So, you know, they were trying their best to sort of push back against what the party at the center was deciding, or like the, you know, the ways that the rules with which they operated. So they went, and that seemed to miraculously work in favor of the residents for that ward, because they like really went out of their way and did things to you know, keep their position, right? To really make sure that they come back elected again, because they do not have that support from the center. So, I mean, I think they also definitely balance these when they make decisions. It's not all like, you know, altruistic that, you know, I'll take care of my ward. There might also be possibility where, you know, both the political parties align, the one that the corporator belongs to and the one at the center, and somebody from the top is really, you know, pushing their agenda onto the corporator to make a decision. So I think both those things are possible in decision making. It can go either way, but the fact that, you know, it's good to know that dynamic exists, so that as a designer, you know what is at play, right? Like you are not going into the equation unaware of what is going to make or break the sanction for your design. So I think that is what I found fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
There are a couple of questions from the students. I think Ari had questions. Are you there?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, I'm here. Thank you for the presentation. In fact, my thesis topic is almost on these lines. I'm really glad I attended the talk. So my first question is this idea of treating every water edge as a waterfront. So how do you break away from that? So through any of your projects, how have you addressed that issue? That's my first question. Yeah, please answer that, and then I'll go to the second.
I'm sorry, who is this question for me or?
Yes, ma'am, sure.
I think it's open to all of you. It's open to all of you, actually.
Yes.
I liked your question.
Well, well, I think I'm not, to be honest, I haven't worked on any projects that deal with waterfront developments. But I would say is when you look at waterfront developments, it's all about real estate. It's nothing to do with ecology. And that's what is, that's like the trend that's happening around the world. And unfortunately, we are following it as well. And well, how do you break away from it? I'm just gonna, I need to think about it, but then I'm just gonna let what the others have to say, and I'll probably come back to your question.
Could you repeat your question? What were you asking about waterfront development?
Yes, ma'am. Treating any water edge as a waterfront, and I think it's just like ma'am pointed out, it's a very real estate sort of a point of view. So how do you break away from that, especially as architecture students who want to make an intervention? So how do you break away from that?
You know, I mean, in terms of design, one could work on that, but eventually these things are run by, you know, either, well, I suppose as planners, one could work on it, but I don't think at an architectural level, you have much control over what happens at, yeah, you know, for waterfronts. So eventually you're at the mercy of, you know, what is in the master plan and what happens, you know, as nexus between developers and the municipal government. I mean, but in terms of design, I mean, I think the possibilities are endless. There is no restraint as far as, you know, what you can conceive of in terms of waterfront development.
One thing that comes to my mind is, I'm sorry. Sorry, Parul, go on.
No, go ahead, Avis.
So when you look at a plan, and then you have your water, be it a river or a tank or a lake, there is like what I mentioned in my presentation. You have to start somewhere. I think even when you're starting to design, you have to put down this divide between land and water. So instead of like having it as a solid divide, trying to like, dam it and making sure that, oh, when it rains and when the water expands, I don't want water to come into my nice garden or whatever I'm designing here. So, I mean, instead of going with that kind of an attitude, kind of try to make that the interface between land and water a bit more fluid, maybe, so that it accommodates the change in the water levels, the receding and lowering of increasing and receding of the water levels. So kind of instead of putting a wall or dam like the picture of Sabarmati that I showed, maybe have like a more fluid, like step it up, or just from the top of my mind, actually, I don't even know, but this is like a site without context, but divert excess water. In fact, if you look at Coimbatore, they have a very, like their traditional system that Coimbatore is built on is a very interesting one. They have something called anikats that divert water from the river whenever the water floods. So, like translating that into a more urban and built environment is what I can think of right now. Yeah. Back to you. Back to you, Parul. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking, what are we looking at waterfront development from which aspect? Are we looking at it from the point of view of enjoyment of a waterfront by human beings? Or are we looking at it ecologically? Because those two are very different things, We can go to cities and realize how vibrant a waterfront is, but it's not the most ecological solution. So it really depends, what takes priority in terms of design. The Delhi waterfront. Sorry?
Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. Please go on. Actually, that leads me to my second question, but yes, ma'am, please complete.
And no, I was just going to bring up the fact that, the Yamuna that flows through Delhi has been just left untouched. There is no contact that the city has with the water, really. And there have been several movements to try and develop it, which has met with a lot of resistance from environmentalists, and I think to good reason. But neither of the situations is a successful one. There are embanked cities like London or Paris, and they flood because they are embanked rivers. And then you don't embank it and you leave it be. He has not been successful at all either in waterfront, in maintaining waterfront as a pristine ecologic kind of setting. Yeah, that's all.
Yes, ma'am. So that leads me to my second question. So I'm trying to understand how, in terms of water infrastructure, it's such a big system, as you just pointed out. Can there be an architectural intervention in terms of water infrastructure? Have you come across any projects or worked with any? Because one, you can make an insert or a plugin and say that you've addressed a very small part of it. But on the other hand, you can address the whole system also. So have you, any of you, ma'am, come across any projects or worked with any on that scale?
The end goal being what? What are you looking at?
In terms of having an architectural intervention in water infrastructure. Now, that's a very engineering side. Many people would think that, only engineering side can or do anything or intervene in terms of water infrastructure. But how about making an architectural intervention to the whole of the ecosystem there? Is it possible, or are there any projects that you're aware of or work with?
I think Singapore is a very good role model in terms of doing water-based projects of their waterfronts, which are actually geared towards water security. They have very few reservoirs of their own, and they've really sort of worked on trying to expand their water bodies. So I think that's something you could definitely look at.
Ari, you can have a look at what is called LUSH. Full expansion, I have forgotten. It's an act that is made in Singapore, which talks about the idea of landscape and water retention. You can have a look at it. Okay, it's called LUSH. All of them are capitals, so look at it.
Okay, thank you.
You can probably also look at Hathi Gaon, which is a project by Rahul Mehrotra Architects, and the landscape was designed by architect Mohan Rao. And that's a very good, because the Hathi Gaon is, I think the landscape was kind of designed in a way to include water bodies. I think it was a very like semi-arid region, and then water bodies were introduced because water is such an important element for elephants. So that's a very good project as well.
There's another project from Mohan Rao which talks about city layout development. I don't remember which city, either it is Nasik or Surat. Check on his website, you might get details. What the river expanding and contracting and the idea of land planning.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Sharmila also has a question. Sharmila, if you're here, could you?
Yes, ma'am.
Here? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Sharmila. I'm from the 8th semester. First of all, I loved all of your presentations. It was a really great insight into the reality of things and the bigger picture. And I can't say it makes our job like easier, but yeah, that's why the question. So this question is mostly to Parul ma'am. It's regarding food being localized using new technology like hydroponics. So is a huge initiative like this really possible in India for, you know, a large scale perspective? And how does one put something like a green roof onto someone's house? Because I mean, without actually forcing this activity onto them. And how do you see this kind of culture being grown in our society?
I think hydroponics is being done quite widely in India already. It's a good system. The only shortfall being that, you know, we do have a scarcity of water, which China doesn't face. In fact, in Shanghai especially, the water table is very high. If you dig up 1.5 meters below the ground, you'll hit water. So much so that, you know, all the skyscrapers that you see on the, you know, the skyline, they've all had to be built with raft floating foundations because, you know, the water is, there's so much water. So yeah, I mean, hydroponics is very possible as long as water is managed well. What was your second question?
Is it really possible in India for a large scale perspective? Like, unless it's added onto something, probably a restaurant or a commercial building, do you think it, I mean, that's a small portion of the urban landscape, right? I mean, most of the buildings are residential, and if you want to actually create a huge impact, you would have to think about green roofs over residential buildings and stuff like that. I think that is kind of the vision that Biome also has in their farm. So yeah, that.
It's about mobilizing communities. So you said, is it possible to have a rooftop on somebody's house without forcing them to look after it? But that would mean it's a community project. And then it, you know, it comes down to how your community is structured and what are the relationships. giving access to outsiders to access your roof. It depends on a lot of things. At one point, I had a scheme in my head, which I wanted to, actually implement in starting out with my parents' neighborhood in Delhi, which would have been to, do rainwater harvesting to allow, and rainy wells to allow, streets not to flood, and then to have these kind of community projects so that the entire neighborhood could be thought as a self-sustaining entity in terms of, growing not entirely its food, but at least a part of its food. So I don't know whether it's been done yet at a communal level, but I think there's tremendous potential in an idea like that. Was that it? Did you have another aspect to your question?
Not really. I think because it's not been done a lot, we can't really answer to the practicalities of it, whether it actually works in the long run since it's being experimented. I think
it works better on larger commercial buildings. I don't think it would work on a residential building unless the owner himself wanted to, have a rooftop garden. But large commercial, and this is what Ricky has done, she leases the rooftops of large commercial buildings and then sets it up. So she pays a rent on it and then is allowed access to do whatever she wants. And I think that's something that can easily be done anywhere.
Okay.
Any other questions from the students?
Shalini, we are over time, so maybe now we can
Yes.
kind of
The principal has left due to some urgency, and he was there for all the 3 talks, and he's asked me to say that they were really wonderful, and he asked me to thank you guys on his behalf. So yeah. And
thank you so much for having us here.
I'd like to I'd like to invite the students to conclude the session.
Thank you, ma'am, for a very insightful meeting here. Really enjoyed it a lot, and it was very informative, and we all had a lot of takeaways from it. I also thank the principal for giving us such an opportunity, and the dean sir. And I also thank the other teachers, Shweta ma'am, Anuradha ma'am, Salila ma'am. It was great to have this conversation with all of you. I also thank the audience for their patience, and thank you for joining us. Hoping to see you all again on this platform in the future.
We'd like to thank you for making this such an interactive session and giving us so much insight on these topics with all the brilliant presentations.
With a pleasure. Thanks for joining us, Padmavati and Vishwanath, and Parul and Abhijna and Sayali. Wonderful talks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shalini, as well.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, my thanks. It was very nice to listen to all of you.
Yes.
I like engineering, and it was lovely to listen to all of you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm glad I came.
Thanks for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Dinesha was also here.
Yes, I saw
a lot of people were there.
Yeah, I'm here too. Yeah.
Dinesh, would you like to say a few words?
Actually, I have too much to say, which is why I kept quiet. So,
you should have said something.
I would love to have just threaded the 3 talks together, and I think that was really fascinating. And I mean, very briefly, as somebody who's been kind of at the intersection of academia and praxis, it's always been a challenge that what kind of direction do you choose? Are you an evangelist? Are you an activist? Or are you just trying to subvert your client's program? Because we are inevitably we are working for the powers that be, and we are always, like you said, when you draw the river, when you draw the line, it's always part of that whole, extractive, exploitative, consumption kind of oriented model of economy. And we are very much participants in that. So it's always a challenge. I envy the privilege of people in academia because they don't have to engage with it.
But I think you made a very important point, Dinesh. I think this is an important
You put
lesson
the ball
for the
back in our court
students.
by saying that you're teaching. Try
No, but
teaching
then
better.
it tells the students that they should take positions, right? So the position of the architect or the engineer or the bureaucrat can't be one of neutrality, which is what you are highlighting. One has to take a stance and work with it or work on it, right? Is that kind of coming through from what you're saying, what these talks told us to. Parul, you want to say something?
I was just going to add to that and say that, well, I think it's the difference between an individual drawing up a scheme and teamwork. And if you can work in teams and look at a lot of ideas from a lot of different positions, that might lead to better answers than a singular ego believing in its own vision.
That is very
wonderfully said.
true.
Thank you. Wonderfully said. Thank you. Thank you.
So, should we end on that note then?
Yes, I think it's a really, really interesting, wonderful session. I think the responses are speaking for them. Like, I think everyone had a really, really good time, for this. I think it really worked out, the conversation. So I think, thank you everybody so much on behalf of Parul College.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Good night.
Thank you for all
Bye-bye.
the ideas as well.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you and bye-bye. Have a nice day of what's remaining in across multiple parts of the globe. So that's why.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye and good night.
Bye-bye.